This series of videos will cover the structure and function of the respiratory system. These are the session objectives that you should use when studying this material. The respiratory system is comprised of a number of components. The general categories are the airways, which bring air into the system, the lungs or respiratory portion, which actually conducts gas exchange, and then the support structures such as blood and lymphatic vessels and nerve. In addition to the gas exchange function, which is the main function of the respiratory system, phonation or speech and olfaction or smell also depend on this system. Let's go back to those two major divisions of the respiration system. The conducting portion is the airways, which function to move air in and out of the structures. The respiratory portion is where the actual gas exchange occurs. So what substructures are in each of these two major divisions of the respiratory system, and what might go wrong with them that would lead to clinical issues? So in the conducting portion, inspiration, air is inspired via the nasal cavity, and then down to the nasopharynx, and then through the larynx, which is where phonation will occur, then into the trachea and the bronchi, and then into the larger or primary bronchioles, all the way through into smaller and smaller branches until you get to something called a terminal bronchiole. Then in the respiratory portion where gas exchange occurs, there are specialized bronchioles called respiratory bronchioles, which actually can conduct some limited gas exchange. And then there are alveolar ducts and alveolar sacs. And that's where most of the gas exchange is taking place. So in the conducting portion, you can break it down into the subdivisions, the oral and nasal cavities, because we sometimes breathe through our mouth, especially if you have a clogged up nose. The larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi, and all of those structures contain cartilage. That's important because cartilage is a support structure in this system. It keeps the airways open. The bronchioles are distinguished from the other portions of the conducting system because they don't have any cartilage. Therefore, they don't have that cartilage skeleton, so to speak, that keeps them open. This is called the airway patent, the open airway. So what's contained in the nasal cavity? Well, the nasal cavity has several different areas. The vestibule, where you actually bring the air in. The respiratory region, which has conchae, which are kind of swirling areas, right, lined by respiratory mucosa. So what is respiratory mucosa? Well, mucosa equals epithelia plus lamina propria, and in this case, the epithelia is always pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia. This mucosa acts as an agent for warming and moistening the air, and the mucus there helps filter out particulate matter, and you also have nose hairs which help filter out the particulate matter. There's a specialized region in the roof of the nasal cavity called the olfactory region. That's the last region of the nasal cavity we're going to talk about. And that is lined by a very special mucosa called olfactory mucosa, and that has special receptor cells which help you smell. So first, let's look at the histological features of the respiratory region. Remember, the respiratory epithelium is that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It has numerous cell types, although when you look at this picture, it may be hard to see anything other than the goblet cells because the goblet cells are so abundant here. However, those are interspersed with very thin ciliated cells, and you can see hopefully you can see the layer of cilia at the surface, the apical portion of this epithelial layer. There are other cells called brush cells, which have blunt microvilli, and those synapse with afferent nerve fibers, and they essentially have sensory stimulation of the mucosa. They regulate that mucosa. There's another cell population called granule cells. These cells are part of what we call the enteroendocrine system. Enteroendocrine cells are cells that secrete across the basal lamina, and their secretions are taken up into the blood system and may go to distal sites. There's also the stem cell population called basal cells, which are in charge of regenerating and renewing this epithelial layer. Underneath that, there's the lamina propria, which contains a large vascular network, which is really the main component that warms the air that you inspire. Now let's take a look at the olfactory epithelium. So at first glance, comparing the picture in this slide to the prior one, you can see the olfactory epithelium is quite a bit thicker. It has more depth, it appears to have more cell layers. However, this is still called a pseudostratified ciliated columnar. However, it's specialized, and it has different cell types in it than the respiratory epithelium did. It has, first and foremost, the receptor cells, which are bipolar neurons. It has a population of support cells, kind of analogous to glial cells in the rest of the nervous system, and those are called sustentacular cells. It also has a population of basal cells, which act as the stem cell population, and it has brush cells, which are the same as what we saw in the respiratory epithelium. Now, you will not have to distinguish those cell populations one from another because you can't do it in a routine H&E. They all look pretty much the same here. So you just have to know what they are. You don't have to distinguish them one from another when you get to lab. The lamina propria has other special features that are important for the functioning of this mucosal layer. And those include olfactory glands, also called Bowman's glands. Olfactory glands is good enough for me, though. These have serous secretions, and that functions as a solvent that clears the mucosa of odoriferous substances. There are also a number of small, unmyelinated, as well as some myelinated nerve bundles, we call those fascicles, down there in the lamina propria, and those are the olfactory nerves. And there's a lot of vasculature there. Just as there is in the respiratory portion, there are very large vessels here, which also, act in the same fashion that they did in the respiratory area, to warm and moisten air. So here's another view of the olfactory region, where you can see the epithelia at the top, the lamina propria, which is everything else in the field of view underneath the epithelia. And there are three very large bundles. One right here, which is a very large bundle of nerve fibers, another one here, a portion of one here, and a portion of one there, over there. Those are all olfactory nerves. There are also portions here, and a little bit here, and some up here of the glands, and you can actually see the ducts of those glands that penetrate through the epithelium and secrete onto the surface here. So those are the olfactory glands. And this will become a little bit clearer when you look at more sections, as we will in lab. So the inspired air then reaches the pharynx after it leaves the nasal cavity. The pharynx connects the nasal and oral cavities to the larynx and the esophagus. So it's kind of a dual-purpose passage for air, food, and the phonation, or production of speech. So behind the nasal cavity, we call it the nasopharynx, and behind the oral cavity, we call it the oral pharynx. Beneath that, once you enter into the larynx, so the passages kind of cross here, and the esophagus goes to the back, and the larynx is kind of to the front there. So you enter the larynx, and there are vocal folds at that point, and vocal cords, which are used in the production of sounds. After that, you enter the trachea. So the trachea has several layers in the wall. First, it has a mucosa, again, the epithelia being pseudostratified ciliated columnar, with an underlying lamina propria, which has immune cells and blood vessels like you would expect any lamina propria to have. Underneath that is a layer of a little bit denser connective tissue called the submucosa, and that often contains the larger blood vessels as well as glands and nerve bundles. Underneath that is the support structure, the C-shaped rings of cartilage. We haven't studied cartilage as a specific tissue yet, but we will do that a few blocks down the road when we do musculoskeletal. But just for now, be aware that there are several types, and this one's called hyaline cartilage. There's also a small layer of muscle, smooth muscle, which kind of joins the two ends of the C-shaped cartilage rings that support the trachea and keep it open. In other words, they maintain the airway patent. And outside of the cartilage layer, there's an adventitia, which is generally a general term for a connective tissue outer layer. And that has some loose connective tissue fibers, blood vessels, nerves, oftentimes a lot of adipose for cushioning. So here's some more images of the trachea, which shows you the epithelia and the lamina propria at higher magnification. So what cells populate the epithelia? Because that's really going to determine what's going on here in terms of function. So there are ciliated cells, because this is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and the ciliated cells function to move the mucus over the epithelium. So when you inspire, the mucus that lives there, or is part of that tube, traps particulate matter, pathogens, so on, and the ciliated cells that beat move that mucus up out of the airways, and you end up swallowing it. There's also goblet cells which produce and secrete all that mucus. There's more of those brush cells and more of those granule cells that we discussed earlier. And then there's the basal cells or stem cell population. So this is very similar to what we saw in the respiratory epithelium of the nasal cavity. So let's take a closer look at the brush cells and granule cells and how they function. You can see from the diagram, the cell on the left, the brush cell, has those blunt microvilli that extend out past the apical surface into the lumen, essentially, of the trachea or whatever other airways that they reside in. And they are essentially sampling what's going on out there, and sending a signal back to the CNS. So they're involved in local control through cholinergic signaling mechanisms. Next to that, you can see a special cell called a Clara cell, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And next to that is one of those granule cells. And those are characterized by having secretion granules. However, as opposed to goblet cells and other secretory cells that secrete out of the apical surface, these are going to secrete across the basal surface. Their secretions will cross the basal lamina and get into the underlying connective tissue, and from thence into the bloodstream. Sometimes they affect nearby cells. That's called paracrine secretion. But if their secretions routinely reach the blood system, then they're endocrine secretions. That's why we call them enteroendocrine cells.